Konnichiwa and hajimemashite, my fellow nerds. My name is Akira, and I'm super excited to welcome all of you wonderful nerds to the very first episode of Akira Does Japan, where me, Akira, takes you on a wild journey full of samurai and rice politics through the different eras of Japanese history. We'll go on a journey from the first rice farms to Queen Himiko, to Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the Mongol invasion of Japan, to Oda Nobunaga, and all the way to when Emperor Meiji finally took back control of the land of the rising sun. Now, who am I? I'm Akira, of course. Now, is that my real name? Of course not. I don't want any crazy people looking me up and knocking on my door to force me to commit seppuku because I accidentally mess up the names of Yoshitsune and Yoshinaka, or because I don't call progenitor god Izanagi he who invites. And before you think I'm overreacting, I promise you I'm not. Have you seen the internet lately? No, Akira is named the character you see on screen, and he's going to be delivering you all the awesome ins and outs of Japanese history that he can. Now, while in real life I am in the process of getting a master's degree in history, along with degrees in cultural anthropology and Japanese, I want to preface everything in this series by saying I am not a published academic researcher. I don't have a PhD in East Asian studies, although one day in the future I'd like to. I'm just a nerd who loves anime, good food, history, and culture. I just also happen to, for almost all of my projects, papers, and research topics throughout school, find myself drawn to the history of Japan, and I want to share a little of what I have learned with you all. As I mentioned before, my love for the history of Japan all stems from my love of anime and otaku culture in general. So when I began a master's degree in history and I started having to actually research really more advanced topics for school, I thought it was super awesome researching all the real life counterparts from some of my favorite anime and manga. This led me down a rabbit hole that I've seriously yet to emerge from. For real, I can give you all the known details of the life of Miyamoto Musashi only because I watched and played Fate Grand Order. It's what made me go through and read all the amazingly researched books about his life. However, that's not to say it was all easy. The idea for this show came from one simple fact, and that's Japanese history is dense. Seriously, for such a small island, they've had a much larger impact on a global stage than one would think. However, most of the scholarly research I came across when I first became interested in the history of Japan was mostly focused in the 20th century, and more specifically, World War II. And that makes complete sense given that I live in the United States and the two countries, in case you live on the rock, had a bit of a squabble in that war. Me, however, I wanted to learn about samurai. I wanted to learn about Ujiwakumaru and Miyamoto Musashi, about Tamamo no Mae and the Shinto gods. I wanted to learn about the GOAT, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and how he unified Japan after Nobunaga's death. I wanted to learn about the real Mongol invasion of Japan after playing Ghost of Tsushima, and more about Okita Soji, Hijikata Toshizo, and the Shinsengumi. However, the problem was, a majority of the books regarding Japan was mostly contemporary history, spanning from just before World War II and the Showa era to the modern day. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find my samurai. Eventually, of course, I did find books and research about the eras before the Meiji Restoration. However, this was mostly about the preceding Edo period. Seriously, I've read so many books about the Edo period, you could drop me back in the time and I'd be able to slap on a kimono and fit right in. And it took me even more work to find well-written research material from further back. And when I did, those things were hard to read. Seriously, most of the time the language and prose used were so advanced it made my brain belt. I had a bit of an advantage and got better at it since through proxy of getting a history degree, I came to read more dense academic text. It was thanks to that I was able to absorb and finally truly learn about the periods I was so passionate about. My whole epic anime-like journey to become knowledgeable in all things Japan, however, made me realize something. What would a younger person, perhaps in high school or even younger, or someone without access to a university archives or library and PhD-level professors do if they wanted to start researching the same stuff that I loved? If someone like me watched and played Fate Grand Order and wanted to start learning about the real-life Ujiwakumaru, not the one voiced by the incredible Sayori Hayami, and Tamamo no Mae and the time periods they were active in? What if someone wanted to learn about how the Japanese could do what they did in World War II, and the parts of their culture that seem so foreign to us? Well, the answer is they can just do what I did and go read all those incredibly dense and long academic texts. But what if they don't have the time, or what if they struggle with the academic language and weird terms the books tend to have? My answer? This show, that's what. I didn't only read those thick books and articles to learn about Japan. No, I found plenty of amazing YouTube channels and a few gem textbooks that seriously made it easy for me. They had all the amazing information that I wanted to learn and were incredibly well researched, but it was presented in an easily digestible and most importantly entertaining way. They served as a springboard for me into further research and got me to where I am today. And so I decided that to help people who may be in the position I was in, I'd share what I can and make Japanese history more accessible to the general public. Now please, don't be offended by the title of the first episode. I am not calling you all dummies. Not at all. And I'd like to think that I am not a dummy either. Who would call their viewers dummies on the first episode? I just thought it was a funny title that gets across what I really want to do with this series. I want to make Japanese history easily accessible and simple enough that dummies can understand it. Of course, that doesn't mean some of the stuff we talk about won't be a little complicated, but I'm going to do my best to break it down for you, and I really hope you enjoy it. Here today, we're going to ease into it with what I believe is the best way to start researching the history of any civilization or country, with a timeline. Seriously, I love timelines and maps. I'm a sucker for them, and that's what I'll do for you today. I'll go over the periods of Japanese history all the way up to the Meiji era, which, for anyone wondering, begins in 1868 and ends in 1912. The Taisho, Showa, and following eras are pretty easy to find information about, so I'll skip those for now. I'll go over the periods of history before that in this introductory episode. I'll give you a quick rundown of the years of the era, major developments, major historical figures, and some cool fun facts if I have them. I'll even give you some movie, manga, or anime suggestions that feature the period if I have those too. All of this will be accompanied by some books and sources I personally think are great if you want to research them more. I'll leave that list of books down in the description on either Spotify or YouTube, along with the links to order or borrow them if you want. Now, each of these periods could seriously have their own entire semester-long class dedicated to them, and sure enough, their own episode. But to start this first episode, I'll just give you a quick rundown. Now that's not blabbering on in the intro. Ikuyo, hajimemashou! So, a disclaimer right off the bat, all the dates I use for the time periods are the approximate dates. A lot of scholars will sometimes argue that a period started later or earlier, but I'm going to give you the generally agreed upon years. That being said, the Jomon Period, or the Jomon Jidai is the Japanese word for era or time period, begins around 14,000 BCE in the Upper Paleolithic period of world history, and lasts until around 300 BCE. Some will argue that the following Yayoi Period started a bit earlier than the Jomon Period's end. However, one thing that can't be denied is that the Jomon were first, and boy did they leave their mark. If I had to make a comparison for the Jomon people to a culture that people in North America would know, I'd point them to the pre-Columbian Native American cultures of the North American Pacific Northwest. This is due to the amazingly intricate culture that developed from what was mainly a hunter-gatherer type people with limited knowledge of horticulture. Now, there's not enough evidence to say that the Jomon were only hunter-gatherers, especially as we reach closer to the Yayoi period, and this conclusion is mainly researched due to the evidence of a more sedentary lifestyle, which is a fancy word for the beginnings of village life. This comes from the main source of information we have on the Jomon, and that is their beautiful pottery. Seriously, some of the pieces that come from the Jomon period are beautiful. It's always been fascinating to me how people from as far back as 14,000 BCE were able to create amazing things like these. The name Jomon actually comes from their amazing pottery. An American Orientalist and zoologist named Edward S. Morse discovered shreds of Jomon pottery in 1877, and after seeing the distinct style of the pottery, translated the term straw rope pattern into Japanese as Jomon. That straw rope pattern can be seen if you look closer at the Jomon pottery. They had a distinct style of decorating their pottery by pressing cords into the surface of wet clay to get some beautifully breathtaking designs. Now, the Jomon didn't only make pots, they also seemed to be adept at using stone tools in later years, and even showed evidence of bowmanship and deep sea fishing. However, their pottery is a huge reason many believe the Jomon eventually evolved into a much more sedentary village life lifestyle. Pots, especially some of these Jomon designed ones, are fragile, bulky, and not conducive to a hunter-gatherer type society. This, along with more abundant food resources, may have set the stage for our next period of Japanese history. Now, the beginning of the Yayoi period is another hotly debated topic. You will see that is a trend with Japanese time periods. The year I'm going to give you all is 300 BC for the start date, but some people believe that it could have started a few hundred years earlier. However, the generally agreed upon date that it lasts up to is 300 CE. No matter how you date it, the important thing to know about the Yayoi period is that it's named after a large group of people thought to have migrated from the Korean peninsula to Japan. It's generally believed that the Yayoi and the native Jomon did not get along well at first, but after a couple of decades, the two groups eventually intermarried, and the result is that these people are the most genetically similar to modern-day native Japanese people. Now, the Yayoi brought over with them a litany of things from Korea, but one of the most important things was advanced metallurgy. Tools like rakes, hoes, swords, and even things like bells and mirrors were brought over and give us some of those beautiful artifacts from this era. They were amazing at working with bronze, and we could see that in their mirrors, their rakes, their hoes, swords, and other things like these large bells called dotaku, which were used in early religious ceremonies. It's during this time as well where we really begin to see more permanent settlements with buildings of wood and stone pop up. However, the most important thing they brought? Rice. No, seriously, the advanced forms of agricultural, mainly rice farming, was easily the biggest thing we see introduced in this time. I'm not kidding you when I say you live or die by rice in pretty much all of these eras of Japanese history we'll discuss. Samurai payments in later periods was literally paid in rice and farmable rice land. With rice came power. With power came wealth. And that is what eventually led to the first quasi-nation in Japan, with its ruler becoming the first one recognized outside of the country. Yes, China, more specifically the Kingdom of Wei from the Three Kingdoms period, another mind-bogglingly awesome period of history, around the year 238 CE received and recognized an envoy from what they called the Kingdom of Wa. The name of this Kingdom of Wa was the legendary Yamatai Koku, which was supposedly ruled by someone Tomb Raider fans will know really well, one of the most legendary figures in Japanese history, Queen Himiko. Now, ironically enough, not much at all is known about Himiko or the location of Yamatai Koku. All we really know is that she existed and she was the first ruler recognized outside of Japan. Seriously though, the debate over Himiko and the location of Yamatai Koku has led to actual physical violence between historians. I am not joking, two old guys took off their glasses and fought over this. Give it a Google search, I promise it will not disappoint. But that doesn't stop Himiko from taking shape in modern Japanese media as a wise, powerful shaman ruler. Seriously, there's dozens of depictions of her in anime, manga, TV, she's everywhere. So, as you could probably guess, really the only super important person in this period is Queen Himiko. Her and the legendary civilization of Yamatai Koku are parts of the main plot of the ever-popular Tomb Raider game released in 2013. Seriously, that game is amazing, I highly recommend it, even if the actual history is a bit lacking. The foundation of real-life Himiko and Yamatai Koku was built, however, and that leads us directly into our next period. Now, stop me if you heard this before in this video, but the actual start date of the Yamato period is highly disputed. I know, if there's one thing the Japanese always strive for is their dates to be correct. The generally agreed upon range is 250 CE to 710 CE, and the Yamato period is unique as it encompasses two smaller periods which sometimes people use instead. Those being the Kofun period from 250 CE to 538 CE, and the Asuka period from 538 CE to 710 CE. Now, some of you probably just said, "Hey Akira, wait, you just said that the Yayoi period ended in 300 CE, but now you're saying the Yamato period started in 250 CE? And to that I say, thank you for paying attention. Also, I'll let you all know now, there is generally a lot of overlap in exact dates for Japanese periods, and that's why they're so hotly debated on the start dates. So for now, I'll keep giving you the generally agreed upon dates, but I do use generally kinda loosely. The Yamato period had a lot going on, and in the future I'll even go over the specifics of the Kofun and the Asuka periods, but for now I'll focus on easily the most important part of this period, and that is religion. More specifically, the spread of Buddhism. In Japan, the native faith is called Shintoism. And yes, before you ask, Izanagi and Izanami from Persona 4 are the progenitor gods of Shintoism. If you don't know what that is, it's another game I highly recommend you play. However, if you recognize names like Izanagi and Izanami, Amaterasu and Susanoo, those are Shinto gods. Shintoism has a large emphasis on worshipping nature and the spirits of nature, and is still practiced by people in Japan today. And the Yamato period, however, is when a new religion finally made its way to the land of the rising sun, Buddhism. Buddhism, of course, are the teachings of the Buddha and his journey to find enlightenment, which is, I know, a gross oversimplification of Buddhism, but I don't have the time to go into all the ins and outs right now. But during the Yamato period, it became a major debate among the powerful clans and emperor on whether to accept this new religion or not. The profound impact Buddhism had on Japan can't be understated. Coming over from a Korean envoy, the court of the emperor was divided on whether to accept this new religion or not. As you can probably tell, they eventually did, and led to an extremely unique religious system in Japan. Is to me one of the most fascinating cultural transitions in history. Unlike Christianity, Islam, and other monotheistic religions, Buddhism and Shintoism didn't have belief in a supreme god that practitioners felt the need to fight for. Buddhism, and more specifically Buddhism from China and Korea, influenced everything the Japanese court did. The way they started building, situating their government, and even speaking were attempts to become more like China during this period. Buddhist figures intermixed with Shinto figures, and it led to an absolutely fascinating mixture of two religions and cultural practices. I could seriously make an entire episode just on the mixture of these two, but I'll save that rant for another episode. They also from China started learning the philosophical ways of Confucianism and Taoism. In the Yamato period, I always describe Japan as the unruly little brother who was always trying to emulate its older siblings. In this case, the older siblings are China and Korea. China was seen as the first and most powerful nation, and their greatness spread to Korea and then to Japan itself. This little brother mentality, this attitude of needing to catch up and prove their greatness, is an attitude that we see prevalent in the future eras and would even define some of them for Japan. Now, if you learn about anyone from this period, you want to learn about Prince Shotoku. He's basically Japan's Prince Charming. He's revered and honored as one of the greatest practitioners and spreaders of Buddhism in Japan. However, he also kept his Shinto faith and is largely responsible for the peaceful spread of Buddhism in Japan. Future key religious figures in Buddhism like Sachiko and Shinran claim to have been inspired by Shotoku. So if there's anyone you want to learn more about in this period, it's Shotoku. We haven't had too many really important name figures in these early periods, but that is about to change as the capital of Japan changes as well. Okay, now while the last few periods seriously rock, the Nara period is when I believe we really start seeing Japan as we see it today. The Nara period typically ranges from 710 CE to 794 CE, and you'll notice that this period is a bit smaller than the other ones. And there's even some debate on whether the beginning should be pushed back a bit, but it's classified this way due to the fact that in 710 CE, the capital of Japan was moved to the city of Nara, or Heijo-kyo as it was called during that time. The trend of Japanese aristocracy attempting to emulate the architecture, court system, and culture of China continued as Emperors Genmei and the architects modeled the city of Nara after the city of Chang'an of China's ruling Tang dynasty. Now, there's plenty of notable figures in the Nara period, like Emperor Kanmu and Emperor Shomu, who ordered the building of the Great Bronze Buddha statue inside the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Tadaiji Temple. You have the Buddhist monk and founder of Mount Hiei Monastery, Saichiko, Haide no Ara, the writer of the Kojiki, who is theorized to maybe have been a woman. But if you know anything about the Nara period, let it be known that the two great ancient texts of Japan were written during this time, the Kojiki and the Nihonshiki. The Kojiki, or An Account of Ancient Matters, was written by Haide no Ara and Ono Yasumaro at the behest of Empress Genmei and is the oldest extant literary work in all of Japan. Now, the Kojiki is unique as it's both a mythological origin story and a traditional history book all at the same time. Haide no Ara is said to have been ordered by Emperor Tenmu earlier to memorize all the records and oral traditions concerning the imperial lineage. And before you ask, yes, I'm being 1000% serious. This Haide no Ara was ordered to memorize 700 years of Japanese history, and he did it before helping Ono Yasumaro compile the records. Seriously, I've had to have a separate tab open for each of these periods I'm talking about to remember the dates, and this guy memorized the entire imperial line. He was epic. Yeah, Haide no Ara was pretty epic when he wrote the Kojiki, but the main purpose of the Kojiki was to deify the Yamato line of emperors by claiming they were part of a divine line going all the way back to the Shinto sun goddess Amaterasu. And the Honshiki, on the other hand, had a much different purpose. While the Kojiki was essentially Japanese history written for the Japanese with a higher amount of emphasis on the myths of the past, the Nihonshiki would essentially serve as Japanese history for everyone else. The book is a reflection of its time, and the influence the Chinese had on Japan was evident in it. Japan wanted a history written that could rival the annals that the Chinese had. It's not as exciting a read as the Kojiki in my opinion, and while it does include elements of Japanese mythology, it has a much bigger emphasis on the reigns and great deeds of emperors, and serves as the biggest source of information for historians and archaeologists to study ancient Japan. Now, if you want to read these two epic texts, first I highly recommend reading other books or watching videos on Shinto mythology first. Don't worry, I'll leave some of those in the description. But I recommend this because most of the time, the Kojiki and Nihonshiki in written form use direct translations for names. For example, in direct translations, Izanagi and Izanami, the progenitor gods of Japan, are referred to as he who invites and she who invites throughout the story. Now, of course, this is their names from the original text itself, but nowadays, even the Japanese use their new modern names. So if you were to jump right into direct translations without having any more context, you'd probably be awfully confused. And hey, that's what this show is all about, making sure you're not confused. But if we're talking about classic Japanese literature, stories, epic battles and wars, the rise of the samurai, our next period has all of that. Seriously, I'm actually giddy right now, so let's get right to it. Okay, I have to confess something to you guys. This show might have also been an excuse for me to talk and gush about how awesome the Heian period is. Seriously, if I had to pick right now what my favorite period of Japanese history is, I'd pull my hair out deciding whether to put the Heian period or the Sengoku period at number 1. And all my bias aside, the Heian period is epic and arguably the most important period in Japanese history. We have the publishing of amazing classical works of literature like The Tale of Genji and The Pillow Book. We have epic heroes like Sakanoue no Tamoromaru, Abe no Seimei, Minamoto no Raiko, Tawara Tota, Tomoe Gozen, the ultimate underdog and most legendary hero in Japanese history, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, also known as Ushi Wakamaru. We have the first shogun, Minamoto no Yoritomo. There are epic mythological figures like the three great yokai of Takemaru, Shuten Doji, and Tamamo no Mai. There's the amazingly awesome conflicts like the Zenkunen War, the Gosanen War, and one of the greatest conflicts in Japanese history, the Genpei War, which would bring about Japan's first ever shogunate. Oh man, okay. Obviously that's a lot, and seriously the actual episode on the Heian period is going to be maybe 2 or 3 hours long. But for now, I'm going to try to boil all of that down for you. Okay, so outside of the wars, the rise of the samurai, the biggest thing you need to know about the Heian period is that this is where we see Japan start to become distinctly Japanese. What I mean by that is it's during these years that Japan finally turned from trying to emulate the mainland, China and Korea, and start truly developing their own cultural identity. This can be seen through amazing works of art, and more specifically literature. The Tale of Genji was written by the amazingly talented Murasaki Shikibu. It is one of the oldest fiction books of all time. Seriously, I highly recommend picking up a translation or listening to an audiobook of one. You would never believe this was written centuries ago. Shikibu is one of the biggest underdogs in Japanese history, rising from a low-ranking woman of the court to a lady-in-waiting to an empress. The Tale of Genji follows a young imperial prince as he sleeps his way through the court of ancient Japan, and while there's comedy to be found, it's more of Shikibu's way of telling everyone the ins and outs of courtly drama and intrigue. It was pivotal in the development of Japanese literature. Seriously, there were actual cults and temples erected in the worship of Genji, the character from the book. Shikibu's story is as inspiring as her own writing. Moving on from literature, let's start talking about samurai, which I know a whole lot of you have been waiting for. Okay, so if you remember any samurai clans, and not just when talking about the Heian period, but talking about Japanese history at all, let it be these 3 clans since they're kinda important. They are the Fujiwara, the Taira, also known as the Heike. Quick note, a lot of clans and figures in Japanese history normally have 2 different names. It's complicated, but you get used to it. And finally, the most important one to remember is by far the Minamoto clan, also known as the Genji, not to be confused with Murasaki Shikibu's fictional character Genji. These 3 clans clashing together came to define the Heian period. I'll go more in depth in the Heian period episode I do, but I'll give you a very basic breakdown here. The Fujiwara clan was essentially turning the emperor into a puppet by taking over the regency and making sure that their daughters were always married in some way to imperial heirs, which made them the top dogs for a long time. Eventually, the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan got sick of this and teamed up to take the Fujiwara down. But of course, the question came after this, who was going to be in charge? They pretended to work side by side for a bit until an ambitious man named Taira no Kiyomori took control of the imperial court. The head of the Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, didn't like that very much, so he started a rebellion, and was subsequently crushed, and almost all of his children were put to death, as was per usual in this time period. However, Kiyomori decided to spare a few of Yoshitomo's sons. One of them, Yoritomo, was sent to the east as a hostage, and that would prove to be Kiyomori's undoing, since years later, Yoritomo would begin a rebellion from his base at Kamakura, kicking off a war full of epic, sometimes mythological sounding battles known as the Genpei War. Now, I left a lot of context out here, and I mean a lot, but I don't want this to run too long, so I'll move on and leave a few books in the description if you want to go read more. The Genpei War between the Taira and Minamoto clans from 1180 to 1185 is, for lack of better words, epic. Seriously, it was fought all across Japan and features some of its greatest heroes, like the tragic tale of Minamoto no Yoshinaka and his lover, the famous Tomoe Gozen, who, according to history, was part Oni or part demon. It's the center for one of the greatest war epics of all time, the Tale of the Heike, which tells the story of the war with a ton of embellishments. However, the 2 people I want you to remember from the Genpei War are Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would win the war and establish the first shogunate, or military dictatorship in Japan, and more importantly, his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, better known as Ushiwakamaru. Yoshitsune is possibly one of the most famous and legendary figures in all of Japanese history. He's beloved in history by the Japanese people for his tragic story and status as the ultimate underdog. The youngest son of Yoshitomo after his failed rebellion, Yoshitsune was a baby when his father died and seemed destined for the life of a monk. He was raised in a Buddhist monastery but escaped to allies in the Fujiwara clan to the north, and he trained there until he came of age and went to join his brother Yoritomo to avenge his father. Yoshitsune, only a young man, was spindly and small, but went on to win dozens of battles, including the deciding battle of Dan no Ora to complete the Minamoto victory over the Heike. Seriously, this guy was so epic, dozens of plays and stories decades after his death depict him actually being part Tengu. He learned how to fight from yokai and battle demons along the way to victory. There's so much to Yoshitsune, but most of it came after his tragic death. Despite all of his success for his brother, Yoritomo, after all of Yoshitsune's victories, through what I personally see as nothing but petty jealousy, began to grow paranoid that his younger brother would overthrow him thanks to his ever-growing popularity. As a result, despite heartfelt pleas from Yoshitsune of his loyalty, Yoritomo hunted him down. Yoshitsune committed seppuku, ritual suicide, while his legendary retainer, Musashibo Benkei, essentially fought off an army by himself. His bravery, loyalty until the end, and status as an ultimate underdog has carried Yoshitsune through time as a legend. And as you can probably tell, I am a huge fan. Okay, so I'm gonna be honest here, guys. I feel I've done you a disservice with all that I've left out about the Heian period. Seriously, I didn't even talk about Abe no Seimei, Minamoto no Raiko, the Pello book, the Fujiwara Regency. Seriously, there's so much more to the Heian period than what I've mentioned. The actual episode really might be 2 or 3 hours long, but I have to cut this short for now. For now, let's move on from Yoshitsune and Yoritomo to see how Yoritomo's descendants fared after his victory and as we enter the Kamakura period. Okay, spoiler alert, Yoritomo's descendants didn't make it that far at all. Seriously, his title didn't even make it to his grandson before they were basically kicked out of the office of shogun after Yoritomo died. R.I.P. Bozo. His son, Yorii, only ruled for a year afterwards before his family on his mother's side in the Hojo clan essentially kicked him out of office and stole the position from him. He tried and unsuccessfully staged a coup to try to get his power back, but was eventually assassinated. His younger brother, another one of Yoritomo's sons, Sanetomo, was placed in the office of shogun as nothing more than a figurehead for his mother and uncle from the Hojo clan. Sanetomo lasted a bit longer than Yorii, but feared for his life most of the time and never held any real power until he was assassinated in 1219. Only around 20 years after Yoritomo united Japan under his rule and established a shogunate he expected to rule for centuries, his own line, that of the Siwa Genji line of the Minamoto clan, which had produced legendary heroes like Yoshitsune, Raiko, Tametono, etc., came to an end, and the position of shogun, like Yoritomo had done to the emperor, became nothing more than a symbolic figurehead ruled by another clan. Now, I don't know about you listening at home, but that is what I like to call poetic justice and karma for what he did to Yoshitsune. Am I seriously mad at a man who's been dead for centuries for betraying his brother and laughing at his family's misfortune? Yes! Yes I am! Yoshitsune deserved better. Okay, now that rant's over, and what we're left with is the Hojo clan effectively in control of the Kamakura shogunate. And while there was drama at the beginning of the Kamakura period, it's a period in which the foundations of what we see at the beginning of the Heian period had set are built upon. So, as I mentioned in my anti-Yoritomo rant just now, the Minamoto clan, after attaining victory in the Genpei War, didn't exactly hold on to power for long. The Hojo clan of northeastern Japan served as the regents for the shoguns and held de facto power, rendering most of the Kamakura period shoguns as nothing more than figureheads. This is an ironic twist of fate, considering this is basically what the samurai did to the Emperor of Japan in the Heian period, beginning with the Fujiwara, and then the Taira, and then of course, Yoritomo and the Minamoto clan. And it was this that eventually would lead to the end of the Kamakura shogunate. The gates for the Kamakura period begins in about 1185 when Yoritomo won. Some people debate that it started a little bit later, but we can't dispute that it went until 1333 when Emperor Go-Daigo, with the help of Ashikaga Takuji and Nita Yoshisada, defeated the Hojo during the siege of Kamakura and temporarily restored imperial rule. Notice I said temporarily, put a pin in that and we'll come back to it. The most popular and well-known events during the Kamakura period that people may know about, especially thanks to the success of the hit game Ghost of Tsushima, are the attempted Mongol invasions of Japan. The Yuan dynasty, Mongol dynasty, which had in previous years managed to conquer all of China and Korea, had their eyes set on Japan. Japan's relationship with China had already been souring since the Heian period, but when Kublai Khan launched his invasion with over 600 ships carrying over 23,000 soldiers first in 1274, Japan initially scrambled to defend itself. The shogun's office and the imperial court weren't very effective, though it was thanks to the local samurai lords, along with a very well-timed typhoon, repelled the first invasion. But Kublai wasn't about a little thing like weather beat him, so he tried again in 1281, only for another typhoon in conjunction with a more prepared Japanese force to push him back again. The two typhoons that destroyed the Mongol fleets were called by Shinto priests kamikaze, or divine winds. After these invasions, while it was great that Japan wasn't conquered, the cause of fighting both of them really put a damper on the coffers of the shogunate and was pretty much responsible for the decline of the Kamakura shogunate as a whole, as they had to prepare new defenses in case more invasions came, and pay the samurai who fought and defended of Japan. If we fast forward towards the end of the period, in an attempt to try and rein in the samurai lords and restore their power, the Kamakura shogunate took advantage of a brewing imperial succession war. Now, the imperial succession war of this time is extremely complex, but to simplify it here, the shogunate broke up the imperial court into two courts, the northern and southern court, and let them assume the throne and rule in alternate years. Now, one of the emperors, Go-Daigo, didn't like that very much and enlisted the help of Ashikaga Takuji and Nita Yoshisada to finally bring an end to the Kamakura shogunate and the Kamakura period. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of overlap when it comes to the dates of Japanese period. The Muromachi period is typically dated from 1336 to 1573 and will often have overlap with the Sengoku period. That's because the Muromachi period coincides with the reign of the Ashikaga shogunate, which succeeded the Kamakura shogunate. After a small 3-year period from 1333 to 1336 where Do-Gaigo actually managed to restore imperial rule, he didn't have control for very long after that. After he did get control back, he got a little too big for his britches and alienated the samurai class that helped to get his throne back, much to the chagrin of one Ashikaga Takauji, who managed to unite other lords and was declared shogun in 1338. However, it was far from sunshine and rainbows for the Ashikaga after this. The Ashikaga shogunate was not nearly as powerful as the Kamakura shogunate was, mainly due to the fact they had to fight so many civil wars. The northern and southern courts and the emperors in both continued causing trouble for them, and it wasn't until Ashikaga Yoshimitsu that things were finally reeled in. Yoshimitsu established the position of what would later be known as daimyo, which were regional samurai lords which rule over their own domain and swore fealty to the shogun. Keep a pin in the word daimyo, they're going to become pretty important in the next period, I should say. Yoshimitsu allowed lords who had limited power during the previous Kamakura period to make a name for themselves as daimyo, and eventually was able to finally reunify the northern and southern courts in 1392, and finally things looked like they were going to be looking up for the Ashikaga shogunate. Yeah, no. As you could probably guess by now, good things never last in pre-modern Japan. After Yoshimitsu, for lack of better words, every Ashikaga shogun seriously sucked. While Yoshimitsu was able to keep the daimyo he gave power to in check, all of his falling descendants allowed the daimyo to effectively become independent kingdoms all across Japan. Now, what the Ashikaga shogunate lacked in military power, it made up for in amazing cultural developments. There were radical and amazing developments in education. Confucianism was embedded in the Japanese culture. Inkblot painting boomed in popularity. No plays were exploding in popularity. There were breakthroughs in Buddhist philosophy, and depending on how you feel about it, another big event took place. It was during this time, beginning in the year of 1543, that the rest of the world finally found Japan, and oh boy did this change things. Who would have guessed the Europeans giving guns to all the daimyo, all vying for power and wanting to kill each other, would usher in an era of absolute war and chaos. The Sengoku Jidai. Japanese Game of Thrones. No, seriously, that's the only way I could possibly describe what the Sengoku period is. Seriously, you like political intrigue and mirroring? Boom, we got that. You like epic battles full of tactical and mechanical innovation for the times? Boom, boom, we got that. You have larger-than-life people who punched way above their weight class to rise through the ranks and gain power they never could have dreamed of? Boom, boom, boom. Let me introduce you to the GOAT, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Remember earlier when I said I'd rip my hair out picking my favorite period? This is why. There's so much to the Sengoku period, and it's quite literally impossible for me to satisfactorily summarize it, but I'm gonna do my best for you. As I stated before, Japanese periods like to overlap with each other, and as you've been seeing throughout this entire episode, dates for the Sengoku period also are hotly debated. But let me tell you now, the average years that I discussed is 1450 to 1600 when Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara. Some people like to end it with Hideyoshi's unification or Nobunaga's march on Kyoto, but I don't believe we really see the chaos end until 1600 when Ieyasu won Sekigahara. Now, the list of names important for the Sengoku period is a mile long, and each warlord could have their entire episode. For now, if you remember any 3 names in all of Japanese history, let it be these 3. They're known as the 3 great unifiers of Japan. Those 3 men's names? Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. As stated in the last section, the Ashikaga shogunate basically went into a steep decline after the death of Yorimitsu. It led to the daimyo basically becoming de facto leaders of their own kingdoms throughout all of Japan, and the country was ripe for the picking and it begging for one ambitious warlord to take it all for himself. The one who rose to that challenge was known as a misfit growing up, the fool of Owari they called him, Oda Nobunaga. Now, there's an old saying in Japan about the 3 unifiers, and that is, Nobunaga pounded the rice cake, Hideyoshi put it in the oven, and Ieyasu took it out to eat it. This is because the 3 unifiers were all initially allies under Nobunaga for his conquest. Hideyoshi rose from nothing but a peasant and a sandal bearer to Nobunaga, all the way to general, and then became the one to unify all of Japan after Nobunaga's death. Ieyasu, however, stayed in the shadows and took advantage of Nobunaga's untimely death and took all of what he had begun and what Hideyoshi finished and reaped all the rewards to begin his own shogunate. Nobunaga was an upstart warlord in Owari province when the shogun at the time, who in reality was nothing but a powerless figurehead, invited him to Kyoto where he initially asked Nobunaga for help to regain some of his power. Of course, Nobunaga was a product of his time. He helped the shogun by taking control of basically everything, and anyone who tried to stand against him was subsequently destroyed. Nobunaga was ruthless, and I mean ruthless. He destroyed the Iko-Iki, a sect of armed Buddhist monks, so thoroughly that he was declared an enemy to Buddhism itself. He was so powerful, however, due to one very explosive factor: guns. He wisely allied himself with Portuguese and Dutch traders and was the first Japanese warlord to truly incorporate firearms into his army, and that led to him dominating over a third of Japan. However, this was cut short when he was betrayed and assassinated by one of his top generals named Takechi Mitsuhide. After his death, Hideyoshi, who it pains me not to be able to talk about more because he's awesome, his peasant-turned-general defeated Mitsuhide before going on to unify Japan under his banner. This is of course a gross oversimplification, but one unification, one failed invasion of Korea and China later, and after Hideyoshi died of old age with only a young son as heir, Tokugawa Ieyasu swept in, and after the Battle of Sekigahara brought the Sengoku era to a close, to usher in his own dynasty in the Edo period. Okay, now I feel like I'm doing you all a disservice again by giving you this bare bones summary, but I'm trying to keep this video as short as possible. So I'll just ask you all to keep an eye out for the actual episode I publish on the Sengoku period, which will be a lot more in-depth and a lot longer. That being said, when I say the list of names of notable people in the Sengoku period is long, I mean it. I didn't even talk about Takeda Shingen, Uesugi Kenshin, Date Masamune, Sada Yukimura, Yasuke, or any of the other incredibly awesome people. I'll leave plenty of sources for the Sengoku period below, but for now, let's see what Ieyasu, the ultimate victor of the period, built in the Edo period. Okay, so Edo, surprise, is named after the capital city of the Tokugawa shogunate, Edo. You know Edo in the current day by a different name, a tiny little city in Japan called Tokyo. But for over 250 years, from 1600 to 1868, Edo serves as the capital city of Japan and base for the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, as much as I personally believe its founder, Tokugawa Ieyasu, is a fraud who had to be bailed out by Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, there's no denying that he ushered in an age of peace and stability throughout Japan. If you've recently watched the new Hulu series Shogun, or read James Clavell's novels that it's based on, you'll recognize Ieyasu as Yoshi Toranaga, and the book, while it has a lot of embellishments for entertainment purposes, is mostly accurate in its timeline. Ieyasu and his descendants ushered in a system that kept all the major daimyo under wraps and for 250 years ruled over a mostly peaceful nation. Of course, not everything was sunshine and rainbows, but the Edo period is foundational in what made Japan, Japan. Now, there's often a misconception around the Edo period that the Tokugawa during the time basically plunged Japan back into the Dark Ages, and that's why when the Americans and Europeans finally got them to open up towards the end of it, they were so behind in terms of research and technology. Now, while there's a bit of truth to that, I think it's profoundly overstated. One of the most defining policies of the Edo period was Sakoku Edicts, which effectively shut Japan off from the rest of the world. The only outside nations allowed to trade with Japan or even enter Japanese ports were the Chinese and the Dutch, and even then, the Dutch were limited to one port in Nagasaki and were highly monitored. This was due to the fact that Ieyasu's descendants, rightly in my opinion, got sick and tired of European missionaries coming into the country saying they were just going to spread their religion peacefully and proselytize, when in reality they were influencing daimyo and local samurai into assisting the trade interests of their home nation. It was after the Shimabara Rebellion, a Catholic uprising in 1638, that the Tokugawa government finally shut the country off from the rest of the world. The Sakoku Decree also helped the Tokugawa stop daimyo from gaining power by converting, and I use that word very loosely, to Christianity to gain favor with European nations. Unlike in the Sengoku period, daimyo could no longer cozy up to Europeans to get more guns and wealth. After this, the Tokugawa went to work effectively keeping the power of all the daimyo in check. The daimyo were essentially split into two groups: the families who had supported Tokugawa Ieyasu at the end of the Sengoku period, and those who didn't. Again, I'm simplifying, but essentially the ones who sided with the Tokugawa weren't treated like crap, while the ones who didn't side with Tokugawa were treated like crap. A system of alternate attendance was implemented for all daimyo. This law required them to have two residences, one in their home region and one in Edo, where they would spend a year on and a year off living at their home and then in Edo. This required daimyo to schedule long trips from their domains to Edo for them and all their staff, required them to be in constant contact with their home. It essentially was a logistical nightmare and drained them of their resources and kept them as always relying on the Tokugawa and their allies for support. Not only did the Tokugawa manage to keep the daimyo in line, but the culture of the Edo period also flourished. Remember in the intro when I said I had read so much about the Edo period, I could slap on a kimono and be right at home if I got dropped in 16th century Japan? I seriously mean it. It's like that one question your friend asks you at a bar when you're drunk, and they say, "Hey, what time period of history would you live in if you could live in any period?" Well, for me, I'd certainly say the Edo period. Kabuki plays became insanely popular, and the paintings of the time are beautiful, particularly from one brilliant artist named Katsushika Hokusai. You probably don't know his name, but you've definitely seen his paintings before. He revolutionized woodblock paintings with his famous pieces 36 Views of Mount Fuji and The Great Wave off Kanagawa. Samurai at this time essentially had to become bureaucrats, artists, and clerks. The Sengoku period was constant warfare and battles. Samurai going from that to generations of peace was certainly whiplash for them. And while they managed to transition to these more bureaucratic roles, that thirst for battle and violence never really went away, and it led to an explosion of violence which eventually brought down the Tokugawa shogunate itself. But there was a much more prevalent catalyst in bringing the Edo period to an end, and it came in the form of big boats and giant guns, and of course, Matthew Perry. So, answer me this question, dear listeners. What's more American than giant boats and giant guns? Go ahead, take a few seconds to guess. Is your answer locked in? Okay, if you guessed Americans using giant boats and giant guns to show off how awesome we are to other countries to suggest that they ally and trade with us, then you get an Akira Gold Star. Because that's essentially what the Americans did when Commodore Matthew Perry came sailing into Edo Bay in 1853 with his ironclad warships. Perry very politely told the Tokugawa government, "Open up your country to trade with us, or else we're gonna come back in here and we won't be firing blanks this time." The Tokugawa really had no room to argue. They saw the technological gap was far too wide, so they acquiesced to a series of unfair treaties with the US, England, Russia, France, and a host of other countries, and this essentially crippled the Japanese economy. And to say this pissed off quite a few clans, especially the ones who have been being treated like crap for the last 250 years, was an understatement. The Meiji era itself didn't officially begin until 1868, but the 15-year period between Perry's first landing in 1853 and 1868 is known as the Bakumatsu period, and saw what was as close to a civil war as it could be without actually being one, until of course an actual civil war started not soon into 1868. You had two sides to the conflict. You had the Tokugawa shogunate and their allies on one side, and on the other side you had imperial loyalists, and also known as the Sono Joei movement, which was essentially the rallying cry for those who want to overthrow the Tokugawa government and restore the Emperor of Japan to actual power to rule over the country. Sono Joei translates basically to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. These people believed the shogun had went back on his sacred duty to keep foreigners out of Japan. And to be fair, they did have a leg to stand on and a reason to be mad. Seitai Shogun was the official title for the shogun. That translates to Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Force against the barbarians. The sacred duty of the shogun was to defend Japan for the emperor against foreigners, and the imperial loyalists believed that by signing these unequal treaties with outsiders, the Tokugawa government was breaking this sacred oath. Now, at the beginning it needs to be said that both sides, the imperial loyalists, the Sono Joei movement, and the Tokugawa shogunate both wanted the same thing, to expel the foreigners from their shores. However, both had very different ways of wanting to do it. The Tokugawa wanted to take a more calm approach and let the foreigners stay for a few decades in order to learn more advanced military technology and to adapt other advances before going and kicking them out. However, the Imperial Loyalists, a bit foolishly, thought that the American and English boats and guns didn't matter because they had good old fighting Japanese spirit, and they wanted to kick them out right away. And there are even examples of these Imperial Loyalist clans fighting and firing on foreign ships and outposts, to which of course they were always beaten back. It caused the Tokugawa dozens of headaches, and the solution wasn't as simple as taking some aspirin. In my opinion, this is a really tragic tale of two sides who wanted the same thing and the best for the country but just couldn't see eye to eye on it. Seriously, the tension between the two sides eventually got so bad, they both went to foreign powers, the American, the British, the French, the English, and asked for weapons and assistance in taking the other side down. So, in a final attempt to avoid any fighting and to keep his family from being destroyed, the final Tokugawa shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, abdicated his position as shogun. Fun fact, the Tokugawa family actually survives today, and their current head even has a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. But after this, the young 15-year-old Emperor Meiji ascended the throne of Japan, and for the first time since Yoritomo all the way back in 1185 took the title of shogun, the Emperor of Japan, the descendant of the Shinto sun goddess, finally held power and sway in the Japanese government again. This wasn't the end of the chaos, however, as the Boshin War from 1868 to 1869 that followed became known as the final war of the samurai. The remnants of those loyal to the Tokugawa squared off against the new Meiji government in what was essentially a proxy war with the British and French supporting both sides. It eventually ended with an imperial victory and a new era for the Empire of Japan. I wrote a really great paper for my senior seminar about the Bakumatsu period and the chaos that followed, so I'll definitely leave a link to that paper if you want to read it in the description. The Meiji period lasted until 1912 with the death of Emperor Meiji. Of course, after the Bakumatsu period came one of the quickest modernization jobs in world history. Japan not only caught up to European powers within 50 years, they even surpassed some of them, as between 1904 and 1905 they defeated Russia, a traditional European power, in the Russo-Japanese War. They demolished China in the First Sino-Japanese War. Diplomats from Japan were traveling all over the world, and a Japan boom began everywhere from the United States to Europe. The Tokugawa period came to a screeching halt and an empire took its place. However, as surely everyone knows, this plucky little underdog story does not have a good ending. The Japanese army and government would go on to commit unspeakable atrocities in Korea and China following the Meiji era and up to World War II. And yes, I do acknowledge that sometimes the government does a pretty poor job of acknowledging and recognizing these crimes. However, they've been a staunch ally of the United States and Europe in an attempt to counter the North Korean and Chinese threat ever since then. All of this combined is why I really love the history of this country. They went from underdogs to top dogs and back down to underdogs again. But to this day, the Japanese spirit and culture endures, especially in their youth. If you've never been to Japan before, I highly recommend taking a trip there. Some of the people are so incredibly nice, and it's an amazing place to spend a vacation at. Oh man, so that was a lot, as I'm sure you can all tell. But first, before I close out anything, I want to acknowledge that all the music you've been hearing throughout this whole entire episode all comes from the Hoyo mix from the game Genshin Impact, and more specifically TNB, who's a very popular music artist in the Genshin community. He puts awesome remixes out of all the character songs, and those are the ones you've been hearing so far throughout this entire episode. I'll obviously leave a link to his channel down below. If you play Genshin, or even if you don't, I highly recommend you go check him out, but odds are you probably know who he is. But seriously, I feel like I did you all a huge disservice. All of these periods deserve so much longer of an in-depth deep dive, and I promise I'll be bringing those to you all soon. This project here is certainly ambitious, but I really do hope that, at the very least, I've whetted all your appetites of how seriously awesome some of this history can be. I know I've had a blast writing this script, finding these sources, and recording this for you all. I really hope that I piqued your interest enough to either continue listening to future episodes I put out, or to go learn a few things about Japan yourself, whether it be going to watch some anime or going and renting a book from the library. Have fun going through all the sources that I have linked in the description, and definitely go check out the awesome YouTube channels on Japanese history that I recommended down in the description as well. I seriously hope you all have an amazing day, and once again, I'm Akira, this was Akira Does Japan, and I'll see you all in the next episode.